In March 2009, the world felt like it was moving at 1,000 miles an hour. We were right in the middle of that massive 7th generation boom where everything had to be bigger, louder and more social. You couldn't walk into a living room without hearing the hum of an Xbox 360 or seeing a pile of plastic headsets tangled on a coffee table. Gaming had officially moved out of the dark, quiet corners of the bedroom and into the centre of the house, and Resident Evil was about to make its loudest entrance yet. Following up Resident Evil 4 was basically a suicide mission for any developer. Shinji Mikami had caught lightning in a bottle with that game, and the entire industry was still reeling from how perfect it felt. So Capcom did the only thing they could. They stopped trying to hide. They dragged the franchise out of the dark, damp corners of the 90s and threw it directly into the blinding, unapologetic light of the African sun. The first time you saw Kaijuju, it didn't just look different. It felt different. The high contrast whites and sweltering yellows were a physical shock to anyone who grew up in the shadows of the Spencer Mansion. The horror wasn't just lurking in the dark anymore. It was staring you down in a crowded marketplace while heat haze shimmered off the ground. But the most jarring shift wasn't the weather. It was the fact that, for the first time in a mainline game, the silence was gone. You had a partner. Resident Evil 5 arrived in the absolute peak of the couch co-op era. It was a game meant to be played with a friend sitting right next to you, sharing a screen and a health bar. It was the end of that lonely survivor identity that had defined the series for 13 years. It was loud, it was explosive, and it was deeply polarising. We were stepping into an era of action cinema that would eventually lead us to punch a boulder in a volcano. But at the time, it just felt like the biggest, most unavoidable event in gaming history.
Freeze! Are you okay?
Welcome to this little Resident Evil retrospective. I'm Parascreen, and this is the series where we're documenting every single entry in Capcom's bioorganic nightmare in the order they hit the shelves. We've officially survived the jagged polygons of the 90s, the prestige horror of the GameCube era, and the frantic rail shooters of the Wii. Now we're stepping into the blinding, high-definition glare of 2009. We have reached Resident Evil 5. I've been pushing through the heavy doors of the Spencer Mansion since I was 6 years old back in 1996. For over a decade, my relationship with this series was a solitary one. It was just me, a flickering CRT, and a constant creeping sense of dread that I had to navigate entirely on my own. But this time, this is where that fundamental relationship changed. This wasn't just another chapter in a horror saga. It was a global blockbuster that practically demanded a partner. Stepping into Kaijuju for the first time felt like the franchise was finally shedding its own old skin for good. Gone were the pre-rendered backgrounds and the slow burn suspense of the PlayStation era. In their place was a high-octane spectacle that felt more like a summer action movie than a survival horror nightmare. It's a game that arguably broke the series' internal horror compass, but it's also the entry that created some of the most enduring memories of the entire console generation. As we track the evolution of the franchise, this is the moment where the survival part of the survival horror started to feel secondary to the action. It was a massive gamble that paid off commercially, becoming the best-selling game in the series for a long time, but it left a lot of us who grew up with the 90s originals wondering if the series could ever truly be scary again. When you've got a teammate by your side and enough firepower to level a small country, the shadows just don't feel quite as dark anymore. Today, we're driving into a game that is a genuine 10 out of 10 masterpiece when played with a friend, but a frustrating, janky exercise in AI babysitting when played alone. It's the end of the Wesker era, the birth of the Boulder punching memes, and the moment Resident Evil decided to stop hiding in the dark. If you want to understand why Resident Evil 5 is so fiercely defended by a certain segment of the fanbase, you have to look at the couch. In 2009, your living room was the centre of the universe. This was the golden age of local multiplayer, a time when going online was great, but having someone to sit 3 inches away from you on the sofa was better. We were living through an era of Gears of War, Halo 3 and Modern Warfare, where gaming was loud, collaborative, and deeply social ritual. I remember my first time playing through this game vividly because I wasn't playing it alone. I was playing split screen with my cousin, and honestly, in that moment, the game felt like a 10 out of 10 masterpiece. There is a specific kind of magic in that shared experience that a single player horror game just can't replicate. You aren't just managing your own inventory, you're shouting across the room about who needs the shotgun shells or coordinating a desperate heal while a chainsaw wielding maniac is closing the gap. For me, this game is a time capsule. My cousin's no longer with us, and that makes replaying Resident Evil 5 a bittersweet exercise in digital archaeology. When I see that split screen layout, I don't just see Chris and Sheva, I see a Friday night in 2009. I see the snacks on the table, the tangled controller wires, and the genuine camaraderie of 2 people trying to survive a global biohazard together. This is the human element that reviews and frame rate analyses always miss. You can't quantify the feeling of a perfectly timed back-to-back stand against a horde of Magini with someone you grew up with. In that context, the shift from horror to action made perfect sense. You can't really do quiet dread when there are 2 of you laughing and shouting in the dark. The game leans into that social energy, turning the survival horror formula into a high-octane bonding exercise. It traded the isolation of the Spencer Mansion for the brotherhood of the Kaijuju trenches. If you rewind the clock back and play this with a friend, the game's flaws, the clunky movement, the sometimes absurd dialogue, and relentless QTEs, they all just melt away. They become part of the fun. You aren't critiquing the game, you're living it. It's why so many of us look back at Resident Evil 5 with such fierce nostalgia. It wasn't just a game we played, it was a memory we made with people we loved. It was the absolute peak of that shared screen era. And for many of us, it was the last time a Resident Evil game felt like a neighbourhood event. The tragedy of Resident Evil 5 is that the very thing that made it a 10 out of 10 social experience in 2009 is the exact thing that makes it a frustrating, jagged chore to replay alone today. When you take away the cousin on the couch and the shared laughter, you are left with the ghost in the machine, the partner AI. Sheva Alomar is a fantastic character on paper, capable, resourceful, and a great foil for Chris. But as an algorithm designed to live alongside you in a survival horror game, she is often more dangerous than the Magini chasing you, in a franchise built on the meticulous management of scarce resources. The AI in Resident Evil 5 is a chaotic variable you simply cannot control. We've all been there. You've carefully saved the first aid spray for a boss fight, only for Sheva to panic spray you because a stray crow nipped at your shoulder. You give her a sniper rifle to cover you from a distance, and she decides the best use for that rare 7.62mm ammo is to shoot a wooden crate 5 feet in front of her. The game stops being about your own survival and starts being a high stakes babysitting simulator. This is where the jank really starts to bleed through the high definition polish. In Resident Evil 4, Ashley Graham was a liability you had to protect, but the game was designed around it. She stayed behind you, she hid in dumpsters, and she generally stayed out of the way of your crosshairs. In Resident Evil 5, the AI is supposed to be your equal. She's supposed to be your backup, but because the AI lacks the situational awareness of a human player, she frequently wanders into your line of fire, gets stuck behind geometry, or worst of all, stands perfectly still while a chainsaw is being revved towards her skull. Revisiting this later in life without the co-op goggles on exposes just how much the game's design was compromised to accommodate a second player. The tension of a dark corridor is instantly deflated when you have an AI partner clanking along behind you, constantly repeating voice lines and shuffling through her inventory. It robs the game of that quiet, focused dread that defined the first decade of the franchise. You aren't a lone survivor anymore, you're part of a committee, and half of the committee is functionally brain dead. It's undeniable how much this hurts the game's longevity. While Resident Evil 4 remains a masterclass in solo pacing, Resident Evil 5 feels like half a masterpiece and half a headache. It had the potential to hit those same heights, but by forcing a partner into every single frame of the experience, Capcom created a game that is tethered to its era. It's a game that demands a human connection to function properly. Without it, the machine breaks down, leaving you to fight both the infected and the very person who's supposed to be watching your back.
That won't even scratch the paint! Got some sharp curves up ahead! Hold on tight! We're under attack! There are too many of them.
Resident Evil 4 started the fire, but Resident Evil 5 was the moment the series decided to burn the forest down. There is an undeniable identity crisis at the heart of this game. In Resident Evil 4, Shinji Mikami understood that to keep the horror in action horror, you needed moments of profound vulnerability. You needed the village at night, where the fog felt like physical weight, or the terrifying rhythmic breathing of the regenerators in a cold, sterile lab. Those moments grounded the game. They reminded you that despite Leon's backflips, he was still a human being trapped in a nightmare. In Resident Evil 5, the series essentially decided that being scary was a secondary objective. By moving the majority of the game into the blinding, high-contrast daylight of Kajuju, Capcom stripped away the franchise's most reliable weapon, the dark. When everything is illuminated, the fear of the unknown disappears. You can see the threat from a mile away. The tension isn't built on what's around the corner, but rather, how many bullets do I have for 50 guys currently sprinting towards me? It shifted the series' DNA from a survival game to a resource management shooter. The dread was no longer psychological, it was purely mechanical. You weren't scared of the Magini because they were monsters. You were scared of them because they might make you waste your last green herb. This shift towards action was a direct reflection of where the industry was in 2009. We were in the summer blockbuster phase of gaming. Everything had to be cinematic, everything had to have a high body count, and everything had to feel like an epic confrontation. But in chasing that scale, Resident Evil 5 lost the intimacy that made the series special. The Spencer Mansion felt like a character, Kaijuju often feels like a set. There's a reason people still debate this entry more than almost any other. It's the moment the series stopped trying to be a horror franchise and started trying to be a cool franchise. It's the difference between a slasher movie that makes you jump and a Michael Bay movie that makes you cheer. Both have their place, but for those of us who grew up in the slow burn dread of the 90s, it felt like the series was trading its soul for a higher frame rate and a bigger explosions budget. It was the birth of the action era, a path that would lead the franchise into increasingly absurd territory until it eventually had to be soft rebooted years later just to remember how to be scary again.
You grab it.
Okay.
Thank God there weren't more of them.
Yeah, we wouldn't last in a fight with a whole horde.
If Resident Evil 4 was a masterclass in forward momentum, Resident Evil 5 is a series of incredible peaks interrupted by some of the most baffling pacing decisions in the franchise. When the game is firing on all cylinders, like the early public assembly fight, it's an adrenaline rush. But then it hits a wall, hard. There are specific sections in this game that I genuinely dread replaying. They feel like they belong to a different, much worse game that was accidentally stitched into the code. The worst offender is easily the lantern carry section in the caves. In a game that is supposedly about high-octane co-op action, forcing one player to hold a glorified flashlight while the other does the actual playing is a total buzzkill. If you're playing solo, you're stuck babysitting the AI through a dark crawl, and if you're playing co-op, you're basically arguing over who has to be the designated lamp holder for the next 10 minutes. It's a slow, clunky mechanic that adds zero tension and 100% frustration. Then we get the infamous motorbike chase. This is where the game fully abandons its horror roots and tries to be Call of Duty on rails. You're plopped behind a mounted machine gun with infinite ammo, mowing down bikers in a sequence that feels like it was ripped out of a generic 2000s arcade shooter. There's no strategy, no survival, and no scares, just a vibrating controller and a lot of noise. It's a section that hasn't aged a day over terrible, and it highlights exactly where Capcom was losing the plot. These speed bumps feel like they were just added to check a box of variety, but they end up sabotaging the game's flow. Instead of escalating the tension, they just test your patience. They are the moments where you realise the game is trying too hard to be everything to everyone. A horror game, a shooter, an escort mission, and a vehicle segment. And in the process, it forgets what made Resident Evil work in the first place. You find yourself just wanting to get through it so you can get back to the core gameplay loop, but by the time you reach the real encounter, the atmosphere has already been sucked out of the room. By the time we reached the midpoint of Resident Evil 5, a new kind of horror had set in, the fear of putting your controller down. We were living in the absolute zenith of the quick time event. Back in the day, when Shenmue introduced them, or when Resident Evil 4 used them in that legendary knife fight with Krauser, they felt fresh. They were a way to keep you engaged during a cinematic, but by 2009, the industry had developed a collective obsession with them, and Resident Evil 5 was one of the worst offenders. It is not quite as soul-crushing as finishing a grueling boss fight, leaning back to finally take a sip of your drink, and having to frantically grab the controller and pray you don't spill it down yourself because the press X not to die prompt suddenly screams onto your screen. It turned every cutscene into a high-stakes game of Simon Says. Instead of absorbing the story or watching the incredible motion capture work Capcom had poured into the game, you were just staring at the centre of the screen, waiting for the button icons to flicker into existence. It completely killed the spectator value of the game. In a title that leaned so heavily into its summer blockbuster identity, you wanted to be able to enjoy the spectacle, but Resident Evil 5 wouldn't let you. It demanded constant twitch reflex attention during the moments that should have been your reward for surviving the gameplay. Whether it was sprinting away from a crumbling ruin or dodging a literal laser grid, the QTEs felt like a cheap way to add gameplay where it didn't belong. This was the era we learned that interactive doesn't always mean better. When you fail a QTE, you have to re-watch a 3-minute cutscene just to get back to the prompt you missed. The immersion doesn't just break, it shatters. It stopped being about Leon's reflexes or Chris's strength, and started being about whether or not the player was paying enough attention to a movie. It's a mechanic that has aged like milk. And replaying it now, you realise just how much it interrupts the flow of what should have been a much more cohesive experience.
Your feeble attempts only delay the inevitable. The entire world will be infected. A new genesis is at hand, and I will be the creator.
One of the most understated losses in the transition from Spain to Africa wasn't the darkness or the isolation, it was the loss of a friend. In Resident Evil 4, the merchant was the soul of the game. He provided a physical, tangible safe zone in a world that wanted you dead. When you saw those blue flames flickering in the distance, you felt a genuine sense of relief. You weren't just flicking through a UI, you were interacting with a friend who grounded the world. In Resident Evil 5, that magic was replaced by a menu screen in between chapters. Technically, the shop system in Resident Evil 5 is more efficient. You can buy, sell, and upgrade your gear with a few button presses, and the real-time inventory management means you spend less time playing inventory Tetris and more time in the action. But from an atmospheric standpoint, it's a total desert. The shop menus feel like a video game mechanic in the most immersion-breaking way possible. It reminds you that you're playing a series of levels rather than embarking on a continuous, desperate journey through a hostile country. By removing the in-world merchant, Capcom also removed that sense of mystery and reprieve. There's no "what are you buying" to lighten the mood. Instead, you're just looking at a shopping list. It fits the more clinical, military ops vibe of Chris Redfield and the BSAA, but it strips away that weird, eccentric charm that made the previous game feel so unique. This game also highlights the shift in how we viewed the game's economy. In Resident Evil 4, finding a treasure felt like a discovery you couldn't wait to show the merchant. In Resident Evil 5, it's just the currency to be dumped into a menu to make your submachine gun 10% more powerful. It's functional, but it's dry. It turned the act of upgrading into a chore of optimization rather than a highlight of the adventure. It's yet another example of how Resident Evil 5 traded the series' iconic personality for streamlined blockbuster efficiency, a trade that made the game more playable for a general audience, but far less memorable for those of us looking for that special Resident Evil flavour. We cannot talk about Resident Evil 5 without talking about the moment the franchise finally, irrevocably lost its mind. We've reached the volcano, we've reached the climax, and we've reached the Boulder. By the final act of the game, Chris Redfield isn't just a soldier anymore, he's a physical impossibility. If you look at Chris in the 1996 original, he was a lean, capable pilot. By 2009, he had apparently spent every waking second between games doing nothing but shrugs and bicep curls. He was a mountain of meat designed to fit into the hyper-masculine aesthetic of the late 2000s, standing shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Marcus Phoenix. But even with those arms, nothing prepared us for the moment he decided to engage in a hand-to-hand combat with a multi-ton piece of volcanic rock. The Boulder Punch is more than just a funny animation, it's a cultural landmark. It represents the exact tipping point where Resident Evil stopped being a horror franchise and became an unintentional self-parody. In that moment, as Chris grunts and haymakers a piece of the Earth's crust out of his way, any remaining shred of grounded tension evaporated. It became a meme before memes were even a primary language of the internet. It's easy to laugh at it now, and we should, because it's ridiculous, but it also signals a shift in how Capcom viewed their protagonists. They were no longer survivors in a nightmare. They were superheroes who could punch the nightmare in its face. The vulnerability that made the early games so terrifying was replaced by a level of physical power that made the monsters look like they were the ones who should be afraid. While the Boulder Punch is the ultimate punchline, it's also the ultimate symbol of the Resident Evil 5 experience. It's loud, it's over the top, it's technically impressive, and it is absolutely, fundamentally absurd. It defines Chris Redfield's legacy for a decade, and even as the series tried to return to its darker roots later on, the image of Chris flexing his way through a volcanic eruption remained the defining image of this era. It was the moment the series jumped the shark, but to be fair, it did it with a hell of a lot of muscle. If Resident Evil 5 was the series' transition into a summer blockbuster, then Albert Wesker was its ultimate superhero movie villain. We had been tackling this man since the very beginning, from the traitorous STARS captain in the 1996 original to the shadowy puppet master of Code Veronica. But in 2009, Wesker stopped being a corporate saboteur and started being a demigod. This was the matrixification of the franchise's greatest antagonist. Gone was the cold, calculated scientist who hid behind a desk or a pair of shades. In his place was a trench coat wearing, bullet dodging, superpowered entity who could literally catch rockets with his bare hands. Everything about Wesker in this game was dialed to an 11. His plan wasn't just corporate espionage anymore, it was complete global saturation. It was comic book villainy at its purest, most ridiculous form. On one hand, it was incredibly entertaining, seeing the long-standing rivalry between Chris Redfield and Wesker finally come to a head felt like a massive payoff for fans who had been following the lore for over a decade. Every encounter with him felt like a boss fight from a different genre entirely. He was teleporting, throwing metal grinders, and delivering lines with a level of hammy gravitas that only DC Douglas could provide. But on the other hand, it marked the definitive end of Wesker as a source of horror. It's hard to be scared of a man who looks like he's just stepped out of a leather-focused fashion show in the middle of a volcano. He became a spectacle rather than a threat. By making him so powerful, Capcom essentially painted themselves into a corner. There was nowhere left for the character to go but down, literally into a pit of lava. I think in hindsight, Capcom probably regrets closing the book on Wesker so decisively. He was the gravity that held the Resident Evil universe together. Without his looming presence, the series spent years wandering through a villain vacuum, trying to find someone half as iconic to fill his boots. He was the end of an era, the last time the series felt like it had a cohesive, overarching big bad. When those 2 RPG rounds finally hit him in the lava, it wasn't just Wesker dying, it was the death of the original 1996 storyline.
loaded.
Suck on this, Wesker.
Your time's up, you son of a bitch. That was for our fallen brothers.
With the massive success of the recent Resident Evil remakes, the conversation around a modernised Resident Evil 5 isn't a matter of if, but when. We've seen how Capcom managed to take the campy, action-heavy bones of Resident Evil 4 and coat them in a layer of genuine, atmospheric dread. They found a way to make Leon feel human again, and that gives me a flicker of hope for the future of Kijuju. A remake of Resident Evil 5 has a massive opportunity to fix the identity crisis we've been talking about. Imagine the early marketplace sections not as a sunny corridor shooter, but as a claustrophobic, overwhelming survival experience where the sheer number of people surrounding you feels threatening rather than just like target practice. Capcom has proven they can do daylight horror. Now they just need to lean into the tension of being an outsider in a hostile land rather than an invincible soldier on a linear path. The biggest hurdle, of course, is the co-op. In a modern remake, the AI partner needs more than just a tune-up, it needs a total overhaul. We need a version of Sheva that feels like a tactical asset, not a drain on our resources. But more importantly, I hope they don't lose that couch co-op soul. In an industry that has largely abandoned split screen in favour of online only play, bringing back that local experience would be the ultimate tribute to why so many of us loved this game in the first place. And then there's the Boulder. You know they can't cut it. It's too iconic, too ingrained in the DNA of Chris Redfield at this point. I suspect a remake would play a bit more realistically. Maybe he uses a lever or a piece of equipment, but a part of me wants them to lean into the absurdity just one more time. Ultimately, a remake could be the redemption arc this entry needs. It could bridge the gap between the blockbuster action that made it a bestseller and the survival horror roots that the fans have been craving. It's a chance to keep the scale in the spectacle, but to finally put the horror back in the African sun. Whether they can actually pull off that balance remains to be seen. But after seeing what they did with the Resident Evil 4 remake, I'm willing to give Chris and Sheva one more chance to get it right.
It's over.
Yes. Finally.
More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without fear? Yeah, it's worth it.
Looking back at Resident Evil 5 feels like looking at a photograph of a version of the gaming industry that doesn't quite exist anymore. It was a moment in time where more was always considered better. More action, more explosions, more muscle, and more players on screen. It was the commercial peak of a franchise that had finally conquered the mainstream, even if it had to leave its shadow-drenched soul behind to do it. For me, this game will always be defined by that duality. On one hand, I see the janky AI, the frustrating motorbike sections, and the QTE prompts that made me spill more than a few drinks. I see a game that traded the series' legendary atmosphere for a summer blockbuster template that didn't always fit. But on the other hand, I see the couch. I see the split screen sessions with my cousin, the shared victories, and the way this game acted as a social glue for a generation of horror fans who just wanted to survive together. It was the end of an era in more ways than one. When those rockets finally hit Wesker in the heart of that volcano, Capcom wasn't just killing a villain, they were closing the door on the primary narrative arc that began in 1996. It was a clean break from the past, and for a long time, The series felt a bit lost without that central trench-coated gravity holding it all together. It would be years of experimentation and a fair share of stumbles before the franchise found its way back to the dark. But before we move on to the next major entry of this retrospective, we need to take a quick detour. While Resident Evil 5 leaned heavily into the future of action, it did leave us with one final quiet nod to the past. Tucked away in the DLC was a little experience called Lost in Nightmares. A short, atmospheric trip back to a mansion that felt a lot like home. It's a 10-minute story all its own, and it's the perfect bridge to talk about before we leave 2009 behind for good. Resident Evil 5 might be the most polarising 10 out of 10 in my collection. It's a game that aged far differently than its predecessor, losing its lustre the moment the second controller was unplugged. But if you rewind the clock, grab a friend and ignore the Boulder-sized logic gaps, it remains one of the most significant, high-octane experiences of its time. It was the day the horror stepped into the sun, and whether you loved the tan or missed the dark, you certainly couldn't look away. Before you go, make sure to inventory swap that like button and partner up with the channel by subscribing. I want to hear your war stories in the comments. Did you have a cousin on the couch to share the madness, or were you stuck screaming at Sheva while she wasted your last first aid spray? If you're new here, you can follow the entire Resident Evil retrospective from the very beginning in 1996 all the way to 2026 by checking out the playlist on screen now. We've still got a lot of ground to cover, and things are only going to get weirder from here. 16 games down, and we're only getting started. I'll see you on the next one, where we head back to the mansion one last time.